some important information and some guidance to help you all with the application process, and any questions along the way. Please do feel free to ask questions in the chat. We will be pausing between sections throughout the webinar, and we will take questions, but whenever they come to you, please just put them right into the chat and we will address them between the pauses. This webinar is also being recorded, so at the end of today's session, we will be sending out the webinar recording links so that you have them for future reference as well, and can also share with others. And I will go ahead and introduce Peter Howell, who will start us off.
Great. You can put the presentation up. Thank you, Jasmine. So thank you. Yes, my name's Peter Howell. I'm the Executive Vice President in charge of the Conservation Capital Program here at the Open Space Institute. And like Jasmine, I welcome you to this webinar. This is the third full round of grants for the Appalachian Landscapes Protection Fund, and we're pleased to have you on to explain the fund, the application process, and to take any questions you have. I'm coming to you from Manhattan, New York, the ancestral lands of the Lenape or the Lenape-Hoking. And if you'd like, please enter in the chat the lands where you're hailing from. And I think we have that chat up, right? So briefly reviewing the agenda, next slide. We'll begin with an overview of the fund, including what is new in this round, and then we'll dive into the meat of it, which is the grant criteria and how we evaluate projects, but also include a review of our approach toward equity. As Jasmine said, we've reserved time for questions. We'll take them at the end, but we'll also take them whenever you have them. We'll batch them and take them up after each section. So please enter any questions that you have about the content. So I want to acknowledge some of the staff, principally of the Conservation Capital Program, that are on the Zoom today. These are people that you are likely to be dealing with in some form through the application process. Abby Weinberg, our Director of Research, Joel Hauser, who's our Southeast Field Coordinator and also acting Northern New England Field Coordinator right now. Hallie Schwab, our Conservation Planning Coordinator. Jasmine Unal-Rodriguez, who you've met, our Program Associate, who makes the trains run on time here. And Bill Rollick, our Middle Atlantic Field Coordinator. We have a good number of other OSI staff on the Zoom, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to identify them, but we appreciate their joining the Zoom today. I do want to call out our funders, however, and we are very fortunate for the significant seed funding from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. But we are equally indebted to the growing ranks of funders listed on this page that have contributed to the Capital Fund or are supporting our complementary planning, education, and outreach work. It is because of their collective support that we and you are able to advance this important work. So a big thank you to them all. Now to the fund. The overarching mission of the fund is to protect the most biodiverse and climate resilient places across the eastern U.S. with climate in mind. Specifically, we want to support efforts to protect places that can facilitate adaptation to climate change for plants, animals, and humans. Secondly, we also want to support efforts to mitigate the harmful effects of climate change by protecting land that stores and will sequester carbon. So there's a dual-fisted approach here, both adaptation and mitigation around the role of land protection. Now, we pursue this mission through three strategies. The principal strategy, and the one that is the subject of this webinar and the RFP that you have received, is providing grants and loans for direct land protection, both of lands outright or fee lands, as well as easements. The two other strategies that we won't cover today include smaller grants we provide, as well as technical assistance to land trusts, other conservation organizations, and tribes to incorporate climate science in their planning work, in their land conservation and management plans. Through our Land and Climate Program, a partnership with the Land Trust Alliance, We recently announced some $400,000 in grants to help groups across the country achieve this goal. This came on the heels of a first round of grants of some $400,000 last year to achieve the same. We are also involved in producing reports, guides, and offering workshops on climate and conservation planning to the broader field, including land trusts, conservation organizations, tribes, and public agencies. So this fund has many goals. Next slide. But the primary goal of the fund is to protect resilient landscapes, as we'll describe shortly. As indicated above, though, we also support efforts to protect carbon-rich forests and management on protected lands that will increase carbon sequestration. We have an acreage goal, some 50,000 acres, and are also doing what we can to integrate equity considerations into our process. We have developed the fund, next slide, after considerable research and planning that identified the larger Appalachian Mountain region as a significant priority for conservation with climate in mind. On the left, mapping by the Nature Conservancy of climate resilient lands lit up this region. And on the right, a map of carbon stores in the region, which account for more than 50% of the stored carbon in the United States. But because conservation is more than just science, we acknowledge the importance of promoting equity in our field. Shown here is OSI's equity statement available on our website. And through the fund, we support projects, as we'll delineate later, that are both spearheaded by economically and racially underserved populations, as well as those that benefit such groups directly. So how are we doing? Thanks to all of you, to the land trusts and conservation organizations across the Eastern US, 10 projects with support from the fund have closed to date, conserving some 18,000 acres of land. We expect another 14 projects with support from the fund that will conserve 18,000 acres more. That will bring to the anticipated total of about 36,000 acres toward our 50,000 acre goal. We've invested about $4 million so far, with another $48 million in matching funds for those closed and pending projects. In other words, for every dollar invested by the fund, there have been about 10 other matching public and private dollars. So let's just pause here to see if there's any questions in the chat before we move on. Jasmine, anything that has arisen that we should take up?
No, not at this time.
Great. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bill Rawlik, who will explain what's new in this round and some details about the fund, including loans, the grant process, and some aspects of our due diligence. Bill.
Thank you, Peter. I'm Bill Rawlik. I oversee the fund in the Middle Atlantic region. And I'd like to start by telling you about a few new things for this third round. The first thing I'd like to cover is which focus areas are eligible in this round. The first is a new focus area in Western and Central Pennsylvania. This, as you can see that the eligible focus areas for this round are shown in green. And the focus area in Western Pennsylvania covers about 10 million acres, about 1/3 of the state of Pennsylvania. It includes parts of the High Allegheny Plateau and Central Appalachian forest ecoregions. The second area to the south, called the Cradle of Southern Appalachia, was active in previous rounds. It covers portions of Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and the western edge of North Carolina, and it lies largely in two ecoregions, the Cumberland and Southern Ridge and Valley ecoregion, and the Southern Blue Ridge ecoregion. Two of our initial focus areas that you can see shown in gray won't be eligible for funding this round. In these areas, we've had success in funding numerous projects, and we have some funds left over, but we're looking to reload funding. In these areas, we have a robust pipeline of 8 approved but not yet closed projects that will protect nearly 17,000 acres over the next year. And we are exploring renewed and new funding support in these focus areas for future rounds. Next slide, please. We have the next slide.
Bear with me, Bill.
Okay,
There's a little lag. Sorry.
no worries. Got a nice picture of an eastern prickly pear. So some other new things in this round are that the overall process is the same, but we have made some changes to simplify some of the content, provide additional guidance to applicants. There is now simplified language in our materials and less need for applicants to do their own science analysis for forest carbon and geophysical settings. Although we still recommend that you understand how this analysis is done on your own. The next point is that we've provided more generous character counts on questions in the application. But that said, it's not necessary to write more unless it's essential. So, you know, we don't necessarily have to read more unless, you know, it really makes the point. The next point is that we've updated our stewardship and conservation easement standards, and these guidelines and supporting information on our website. We've also updated our frequently asked questions. For example, we've added a section about mineral rights. And then one other point about conservation easements. We know that writing conservation easements for both resiliency and carbon can be quite challenging. So we will soon make available a document with good examples we have collected of conservation easement language that fits our criteria in different situations. And then lastly, we've expanded our loan program. OSI can provide loans to support projects that meet the fund's criteria. We have just added a $1 million dedicated bridge loan program in West Central Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. And just a little bit more about this dedicated loan fund in Pennsylvania. There's $1 million available. The purpose is to provide funds that for time-sensitive projects that may need funds quickly in order to secure the project and close. And the purpose is really to protect projects that have strong resiliency and forest carbon attributes. And the eligibility is nonprofit land trusts and the private sector, including, for example, local governments. The terms are 0 interest and 18 months to complete the loan. These are bridge loans, so they're not long-term loans. And for the process, I think the easiest thing to do would be to, if you have a loan opportunity, just inquire with the field coordinator, which is myself in Pennsylvania. Next slide.
Apologies. I am having a little lag on my end in slide transition.
Wow.
And just a quick overview of funds available in the cradle of the Southern Appalachians. We have quite a bit of money, 5.3 million available. And in West Central Pennsylvania, we have 3 million in grants available and the 1 million in loans that I just discussed. Okay, next slide. And I'll just go over our grant process. So our grants follow a predictable process. In this round, applications are due December 19th. We typically allow about 8 weeks for you to complete your applications and turn them in. Then we go through a staff and advisory committee evaluation with grant decisions coming in March 2023. And then after the advisory committee meeting, the projects are either declined, deferred, or approved. And a deferred project just means it may be, it may meet our criteria, but it may not be ready. And you can resubmit it. And then once a project is approved, OSI will send a grant approval letter a term sheet outlining the conditions of approval, and a grant checklist. And then we do some due diligence review. Our legal staff will review typically the checklist items. And then we send a grant agreement, and then we wire funds at closing. Okay, next slide. This just goes into a little more detail on our due diligence requirements. The checklist really gives a comprehensive list of all steps and items required for closing. And there are a number of due diligence items that will be familiar to anybody who does land deals, like title survey and environmental assessment. I won't go into detail on those. We also need some organizational documents like your board resolution accepting the grant. And once OSI receives some key checklist items, specifically a signed contract, the title, and a grantee board resolution, we can provide a grant agreement fairly early in the process. And then just some other grant details. The grants typically range from $50,000 to $400,000, although it does depend somewhat on the project. There is no absolute maximum. And requests for proposals are provided about every 8 to 10 months, so more than once a year. So if your project isn't ready, you can always wait, and there'll be another chance to submit an application. So I think right now we'll pause briefly for questions, but we'll also cover questions at the end.
I think it would be great to just amplify a question that was asked in the chat about how the focus areas were selected, and Peter and Abby, if you want to just vocalize any of the considerations here, that would be helpful, I think.
Peter, you're muted.
Yeah, looks like Abby and I both responded to that. There's more technical issues around science that I think Abby elaborated on. If there are any questions about that or the feasibility factors, we can elaborate further. Let's see if there are any questions. Perhaps not. Perhaps we answered it. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so then we'll go to the next section, and that'll be Joel.
Hi, everyone. In this section, I will touch on the criteria we use when evaluating proposals. First is a series of screenings. So the first thing for you to check is whether a project is within one of the focus areas for the fund. As Bill mentioned, we're currently accepting proposals for projects in the Western Central Pennsylvania and Cradle of Southern Appalachia focus areas, shown in red on this map. Through a link on the fund's webpage, you can check to see if your project falls within one of the eligible focus areas. In order to be considered for funding, a project must lie at least partially within the focus area boundary. So projects intersecting the boundary are eligible for consideration. The next screening is organizational eligibility. Only eligible entities will be funded through the grant program. So OSI will consider funding for land trusts, state and federally recognized tribes, governmental entities such as state agencies and municipalities, and other nonprofits with compatible purpose. So those may be organizations such as nature centers, environmental nonprofits, et cetera. We will not fund individuals or for-profit entities. It's important to note that land trusts must be accredited by the Land Trust Accreditation Commission or be on the path to accreditation. Only in rare cases will we waive that requirement. If you're uncertain about your eligibility, please reach out to your respective field coordinator, either Bill or me. So we will evaluate eligible proposals based on a set of criteria. Some of these are considered primary criteria, which carry heavier weight. They are that every project, or they're ones that every project must meet to be considered for funding. Primary criteria are that projects must result in permanent protection of properties. They must score higher than average for resilience. Future stewardship that will enhance forest carbon and foster resilience. And the project should be feasible, so having a high likelihood of success. In addition, we'll evaluate projects based on their carbon storage and sequestration potential, landscape context, biodiversity values, threat of forest loss, and community benefit. So I'll touch on all of these in greater detail, some with more detail than others. Climate resilience is a primary criteria of the fund. Projects must score above average for resilience to be considered for funding. Climate resilience data were created by the Nature Conservancy, led by Dr. Mark Anderson. Many of you are familiar with climate resilience data, and though this is a complex data set, I'm only going to touch on the high points of the data, but there are other informational resources available on our website, and we'll post links to webinar recordings in the chat for you to learn more that go into more detail. In a nutshell, resilience data estimates the ability of landscapes to cope with climate disturbances such as heat, drought, flooding, or storm damage, while retaining biodiversity and ecological functions over the long term. In other words, the data seeks to identify landscapes that are most likely to continue to foster terrestrial biodiversity as the climate changes. On the map, more resilient areas are in green and less resilient areas are in brown. The data do not rely on climate predictions, but rather the durable features of a landscape that influence biodiversity. To oversimplify the data, there are two major components that inform the overall resilience score: landscape diversity and local connectedness. You can think of a landscape with high diversity as one with many microclimates. So these can be wetlands or slopes of varying degree and aspects, cliff, caves, etc. Basically places for species to adapt in place as the climate changes. Imagine the difference in temperature and humidity between a north-facing slope and a south-facing slope of a mountain or at the mouth of a cave. These are examples that help me recognize the importance of landscape diversity as the climate changes. Local connectedness, as you might imagine, is an estimate of how connected a landscape is. So one free of roads, development, forest conversion, etc. It will allow movement across the landscape so that species can benefit from the variety of microclimates in a diverse landscape. And combined, these features estimate resilience. The Resilient Land Mapping tool, an image of which is on the slide, is useful in learning more about your project or landscape. This is a tool that the Nature Conservancy develops and hosts, and it's linked on our website and in our fund materials. In addition to showing the data, you can upload a shapefile or sketch a polygon on the map, and the tool will evaluate it for resilience and other climate attributes. The shapefile we uploaded for the sake of example is 4,500 acres, has a landscape diversity that is 1.7 standard deviations above the mean. So that means it's well above average. And that's really what we're looking at, is just how far above average a property is to further our resilience goals. Another pillar of the resilience data is geology, or more specifically, geology and elevation. Combinations of geology and elevation are what we call settings. There are settings such as low elevation calcareous or high elevation granite, etc. Species composition on a landscape is strongly correlated with settings. So it's important that we, in the larger land conservation community, protect a variety of settings to ensure that we protect habitat that will foster the most biodiversity moving forward. And we haven't done that to date. There are settings such as high elevation granite that are very well conserved, while others such as low elevation, moderately calcareous are not. OSI developed the list shown here of the most underrepresented settings in the conservation portfolio. These are settings with higher proportions of development and conversion and lower levels of protection. Some of these settings are highly correlated with biodiversity as well. So it's important that we work to balance the portfolio, and OSI gives preference to projects that protect these underrepresented settings. This list is also included in the definitions and data guide found on the fund webpage. So how do we use this data to evaluate projects? We've developed evaluation guidelines for all fund criteria. I'm not going to go through them for all. But we developed these guidelines to help ensure that we're as fair as possible, applying criteria uniformly across projects. Projects that strongly meet criteria for resilience have overall values greater than 1 standard deviation above the mean. Those that meet criteria score between 0 and 1 standard deviations above the mean. Projects that partially meet criteria score between 0 and 1 standard deviations below the mean. And projects that fail to meet criteria are more than 1 standard deviation below the mean. Projects that contain either more than half of the property or more than 100 acres of underrepresented settings move up a level. And I'd like to note that if your project fails to meet criteria, it probably isn't eligible for funding, but you're welcome to discuss it with your field coordinator to decide whether or not it's worth your time to apply. And a word on the data. We recognize that we're talking about modeled data, and the data are not absolute and have limitations. And you may feel that the data is incorrect for a project you're considering, and it very well could be. Items that may affect resilience scores or current condition, incorrect input data such as settings or land classification. In some regions, it could be industrial ownership. And finally, either recent or planned restoration on the landscape. If any of these situations apply to you, feel free to reach out to your field coordinator to discuss, and we can work through adjusting the data. Forest ecosystem carbon. The fund seeks to protect carbon stores on the landscape and to enhance sequestration through protection and management. We evaluate projects based on forest data carbon produced by Dr. Chris Williams' team at Clark University. I'll wait on the slide. The data is available on the same resilient land mapping tool with the climate resilience data, so the one-stop shop for a lot of climate data. The data provides estimates for forest ecosystem carbon, so carbon that is in vegetation or above ground, below ground, such as in roots and fungal networks, and in coarse woody debris on the Earth's surface. The data were built by evaluation and modeling based on 2010 and earlier forest inventory analyses. An important practical note for this is the data will need to be adjusted if there have been significant changes to the landscape since 2010. So shown on the screen is the 2010 data. Areas in darker green and blue have higher levels of forest ecosystem carbon than those in lighter green or brown. The model also makes projections out to 2050 to estimate forest carbon storage at that critical date. The difference between stored carbon in 2010 and 2050 is the amount that will be sequestered from the atmosphere during that time. Note that the 2050 data shows many more blues and high carbon areas than the 2010. And an important note is that the projection is based on an assumption of no management. So how a property is managed or stewarded can significantly alter the amount of carbon that will be on the landscape in 2050. We're using the average ranges for each focus area to compare projects. We calculated the average forest carbon in 2050 for each of the focus areas represented by the average ranges on the chart. So for example, projects in the Northern Apps with expected forest carbon between 84 and 102 metric tons per acre are considered average. And similar to the resilience data, the Nature Conservancy's Resilient Lands Mapping tool will analyze shapefiles or polygons to give you estimated forest ecosystem carbon for an area of interest. A hypothetical project in the Northern Apps that we evaluated is expected to sequester 0.4 metric tons of carbon per acre per year, resulting in an average of 98.6 98.4 metric tons per acre stored in 2050. 98.4 is between 84 and 102, so it's average for the focus area. Like our other criteria, we have rankings from strongly meets criteria to fails to meet criteria for forest carbon evaluation. Projects that strongly meet criteria are above focus area average for 2050. Projects meet criteria if they're within the focus area average, and projects that partially meet are between 0.5 and 1 standard deviation below the mean, and below that fail to meet criteria. Note that scores may be adjusted down if there has been significant forest harvests or other loss since 2010. So, as I mentioned at the outset, this was a very high-level touch on these incredibly complex data sets that we use for the fund. So we have recorded webinars that will go into much more detail on the fund's core resilience and carbon science if you're interested. The links are on the screen, but will be posted in the chat if they're not already. And we'll share them as well in a follow-up email after today's webinar. So that was a quick primer on the science criteria of the fund. And now I'm going to move on to some of the other criteria. Stewardship is critically important to the goals of the fund and is another of the primary criteria. The stewardship goal of the fund is to enhance resilience while protecting and increasing forest carbon. This can be achieved in many ways and will be specific to each project, but should address mineral extraction, forest management, and potential for development. I'll note that active forest management is neither required nor prohibited. Active forest management may make sense on certain projects, particularly when considering restoration or other improvements for forest health. Likewise, projects may or may not be enrolled in a carbon offset program. Stewardship will differ based on transaction type, whether it's a land purchase, conservation easement acquisition, or whether a property is enrolled in a carbon offset program. We welcome and encourage as well, where appropriate, the integration of traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous land care systems and ways of thinking into land stewardship. In many cases, we will require submission of a management plan prior to closing, but if there are factors built into the project that ensure protection of carbon and resilience, such as enrollment in a 99-year carbon sequestration project or a strong forever wild easement, then we will not require a management plan. A final note on this, the project stewardship and structure must protect resilience and carbon at the time of closing. As such, the ability to enroll a property in the carbon market in the future may be diminished depending on restrictions upon closing. Word on conservation easements. Conservation easement projects have special considerations and requirements. The easement document and how it's drafted has permanent implications on land management and stewardship. And as with everything I'm covering today, we have more detailed information on our website. So I'm just going to touch on the highlights, but I do encourage you to visit our website and look at the updated guidance that Bill mentioned. You should, in an easement, you should include carbon and resilience protection as purposes of the easement, state the property's resilience and carbon values, include forest carbon and resilience attributes in the baseline documentation report, provide clear standards for protection of forest carbon, and when considering easement terms, if applicable, consider how they will interact with a potential future carbon sale. If you're working with a landowner that may wish to engage in the carbon market in the future, it would be worth consulting an expert in the field while drafting the easement. That said, if a carbon sale has not occurred or is not imminent, then the easement must strongly protect resilience and carbon. And I recognize that you may have more specific questions about how projects supported by the fund interact with the carbon market, and feel free to post questions either into the chat, ask after this section, or reach out to the appropriate field coordinator for specific guidance. Another element we will evaluate is the landscape context of a project. It's important for us to understand how a proposed project fits within its landscape. The map on this slide shows a collection of past OSI supported projects in pink and maroon and how they relate to previously protected lands in green. The projects are depicted over climate flow data, which is another Nature Conservancy data set available on the Resilient Land Mapping tool that estimates the ability for wildlife to migrate through a landscape with a preference for movement in response to climate change, so northward and upslope. Areas in blue have higher current flow than areas in brown. And I'm showing this map to depict landscape context because it shows an aggregation of projects working to connect and expand existing protected lands, ultimately increasing the resilience and connectivity within the protected landscape. Landscape context is the one map that we will require you to make as part of the application, since applicants often have better data showing the protected landscape around the project and understand the landscape more than we do. If you do not have the ability to make maps, please reach out to your field coordinator for assistance. Another of the primary criteria is likelihood of success. We sometimes refer to this as feasibility as well. So we will try to gauge the likelihood that project partners will succeed in their endeavors to protect a property. Factors we will consider are availability of funding, project structure, willingness of the current landowners to sell property rights, and the status of negotiations. We expect projects to close within 18 months of the date of OSI's conditional grant approval. And as Bill mentioned, please do not apply this round if you don't expect your project to close in that timeframe. We will release RFPs regularly, and you may apply in future rounds. We also ask for information regarding urgency and risk. This helps us better understand threats to the property, to forest carbon and other natural resources associated with the project. Factors such as ownership and landowner motivation and the type and degree of threat to the land help OSI and our advisors better understand the urgency of the project. We're particularly interested in the risks of development, poor forest management or conversion, and the threat of mineral extraction to the property. And finally, a couple of words on funding. So OSI prefers a 4-to-1 match on all projects, though this amount is not guaranteed to any applicant. We will accept lower match for projects led by BIPOC-led organizations. We do not have a set match requirement for these projects, but we'll be open to conversations about the project and available funding so that we can understand the nature of the projects and the need for grant funds. Match can be achieved through cash and or land donations up to the appraised value of the land or conservation easement. Non-staff transaction expenses, including due diligence, such as appraisals, title insurance, etc. Transaction costs, non-staff legal expenses, and generation of a stewardship are also considered as match. We will also allow the use of the full value of other conservation projects as match. If you are using a match property, you will enter information about the property on the application. For a match property to be eligible for use as match, it must be adjacent to or proximate to the subject property, meet the fund's criteria, be part of a larger plan that includes conservation of the match and subject properties, and close prior to the closing of the subject property, but not more than 2 years before the date of application. We do not allow land restoration and management costs, stewardship endowment contributions, staff time or overhead, or building construction and maintenance to be counted as match. And finally, grant funds must be used for the permanent protection of land, either through purchase of land or permanent conservation easements. In exceptional cases, grant funds may be applied to due diligence and transaction costs with prior approval from OSI. Staff time, contributions to stewardship endowments, and land management are not eligible for funding. And that is it for this section. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has at this time. I see there are a number of things posted in the chat.
Thanks so much. Right now, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. However, Hallie, thank you so much for posting those links to the climate resilience and carbon storage and sequestration webinars. We encourage everyone to view those, and we will also be emailing them out with the recording for today's session later. If there are any questions, though, feel free to raise your hand or pop them in the chat at any time, and we will get to them at the end.
Well, clearly we haven't thrown enough detail at you because there aren't any questions, but that's just fine. Again, don't be shy to contact any of us or to share things later in the chat. But if there are no questions or concerns, why don't we go over to Hallie to talk a little bit about equity issues.
Great, thank you. So we'd like to delve now a little deeper into some of the ways OSI is working to bring equity and justice considerations into the fund and what that means for applicants. We start by acknowledging that all land has a history and that legacies of land dispossession, broken treaties, slavery and racial violence, discriminatory housing and lending policies, and unequal investment in conservation continue to shape current patterns of land ownership, exposure to climate risk, and access to the benefits from nature. And so as a land conservation organization and in our capacity as funders, we've committed to educating ourselves and to engaging in conversations about land equity and justice in the context of our grant funds. In terms of our grant-making process, OSI is actively working to identify and reduce barriers to application, increase transparency about how projects are evaluated, and provide applicants with the support needed to navigate the application process. To that end, you've heard us say this several times today, but we really do encourage you to reach out to the OSI field coordinator in your region with any questions at all, or if you'd like to request assistance as you're putting together the proposal. As outlined in the previous section on the fund's match requirements, OSI will accept a lower match ratio on projects advanced by or that will meaningfully benefit Black, Indigenous, or people of color-led organizations or communities. And in the following slides, we're going to talk more about the land equity questions posed in the fund application and some resources we've compiled for applicants. So in support of our ongoing learning about the history of the land and efforts to better understand who benefits from the projects OSI funds, the application includes a series of questions related to land equity, where applicants will be asked to provide information about the racial and socioeconomic demographics of the area in which the project is located, the community and climate benefits associated with the project, such as access for recreation or cultural uses, flood hazard mitigation, and a whole host of other potential climate and community benefits we'd love to hear about. Additionally, we ask about the Black, Indigenous, and communities of color with historic or current connections to the land, any engagement with these communities as part of the project planning, and any ways in which the project supports reconnecting these communities or their descendants to the land. Though responses to equity questions are not scored in the same way you've seen, examples of throughout this presentation, the information provided in this section is often considered in evaluating the project's community benefit, which is a fund criteria. What's most important to know here is that the questions in this section really offer a chance for you to share local knowledge and context that's not captured anywhere else, and that's really invaluable in helping to understand the project and its impact. So finally, OSI fellow Sydney Williams developed a resource list pulling together books, articles, and podcasts about land history and connection in the Appalachian region, with a focus on the stories and contributions of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This resource is organized by fund region and is available on our fund webpage, which makes it a great resource if you're seeking more information as you're responding to the land equity questions included on the application, And this is a living resource. So if you have feedback or suggestions for resources you've found valuable that you think we should add, we invite you to reach out. And with that, love to open things up for Q&A about any of the topics we've discussed today, and invite your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Hallie. So we have a couple of questions that have come in. From Sean, he says, is the board resolution needed at the time of the grant application or at the time of signing the grant agreement?
That's a great question. It is not required for the application, but it is required for the grant agreement so that you have approval to accept the grant. And we have examples of what those look like. If you're new to this process, we can help you work on that language.
Thank you, Joe. And from Jose, he says, I see protection of existing carbon in a priority mechanism. How would projects be evaluated that increase carbon storage through the reforestation of cleared private lands? Would those be eligible?
Do you want me to take this one, Joel?
Yeah, that'd be great, Abby. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jose. And we have had applications from projects that are essentially restoration projects. And of course, that has a very measurable additional benefit in terms of carbon. And we don't have the tools currently to estimate what that carbon is, but we will work with you to kind of get a sense of what the management will be, how the restoration will take place, and see that as a positive in your project. In terms of the resilience, there's also a component that's going to be inaccurate if you're going to be restoring a piece of land. So we'll also work with you to understand how the resilience score, especially that connectivity score, which is going to change as we reconnect the forest, might adjust. So yeah, we'll work with you on both of those. We won't have quantitative information in those cases, but we'll figure out how to understand the project from those perspectives.
Thanks so much, Abby. I don't see any further questions in the chat right now. But don't be shy, ask away.
Well, hearing none, I think this concludes our webinar. We really thank you for joining, staying on as long as you have. And we will send out, as promised, some information that we've shared already in the chat. And look forward to your questions, inquiries, suggestions, and of course, applications, which are due in December 19th, if I recall the date exactly. So thanks very much to the CCP staff too for presenting, and to all of you for attending. And hope you have a nice week. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, looking
Great
forward to
day,
seeing the
all.
projects.